What happens when one of Hollywood's toughest legends becomes convinced his co-star actually tried to kill him? It sounds like the plot of a noir thriller, but this wasn't a movie script. It was Humphrey Bogart's real life. Bogey, the hard-drinking, sharp-tongued star of Casablanca and the Maltese Falcon, wasn't a man you wanted to cross. He had a reputation for being brutally honest, unshakably proud, and quick to call out anyone he thought was disrespectful. But even for Bogart, who tangled with more than a few actors and directors during his career, one feud stood out above the rest. This wasn't just another personality clash. This was a relationship so toxic that Bogart believed his co-star had endangered his life on set, and he never let that suspicion go. The story begins in the late 1930s, a period when Bogart was still clawing his way out of supporting roles and into stardom. He was tough, determined, and eager to prove he belonged at the very top of Hollywood's food chain. On the opposite side stood William Holden, a fresh-faced actor destined for his own legendary career. At the time, Holden was young, hungry, and full of energy, while Bogart carried the weight of a man who'd already fought tooth and nail to be taken seriously. Their collision was inevitable, but no one could have predicted how explosive it would become. The spark that ignited their feud didn't come from an argument in a dressing room or a battle over lines in a script. No, it came from something far more dangerous, a motorcycle stunt gone wrong. During filming, Bogart claimed Holden nearly ran him down, and in his mind, it wasn't an accident. He believed Holden was reckless at best, and at worst, out to sabotage him. To Bogart, that wasn't just an on-set mishap. It was a betrayal. But what's fascinating about this story is how it reveals a different side of Bogart. Most people picture him as the unshakable tough guy, the one who always kept his cool under pressure. Yet here, we see Bogart deeply unsettled, convinced he'd been targeted by someone working right beside him. The paranoia, the anger, the distrust, it all boiled together into a grudge that would last for years. And when the two men were forced to work together again more than a decade later, that simmering resentment came roaring back, stronger than ever. The truth is, Hollywood history is full of rivalries, but few rivalries carried the same level of personal hostility as Bogart versus Holden. It wasn't just a clash of egos. It was a fight that blurred the line between professional competition and personal vendetta. And for Bogart, a man who prided himself on loyalty and respect, there was no coming back from what he saw as a near-fatal betrayal. But what exactly happened on that fateful set in 1939? And why was Bogart so convinced that his co-star was out to get him? The year was 1939, and Humphrey Bogart had just begun stepping into the kind of gritty roles that would define his career. He wasn't yet the towering legend of Casablanca or The Big Sleep. At this point, he was still hustling to escape typecasting as gangsters and secondary characters. He was sharp, ambitious, and more than a little touchy about being taken seriously. So when the cameras rolled on Invisible Stripes, Bogart brought all the intensity you'd expect from a man trying to cement his place in Hollywood's upper tier. That film also starred George Raft, William Holden, and Jane Bryan, an interesting mix of personalities. Holden, especially, was at the very start of his career. He was just a few years out of Pasadena Playhouse, full of nerves, energy, and eagerness to prove himself. To most, he came across as charming and easygoing, but to Bogart, the young actor's enthusiasm felt reckless. And it all came to a head during one particularly dangerous sequence. On the day in question, Holden had been tasked with handling a motorcycle in a scene that required precision and control. It should have been a simple stunt, the kind of scene dozens of actors performed without issue. But something went wrong. The bike veered off course, and according to Bogart, it came frighteningly close to running him down. Witnesses claim Bogey jumped out of the way just in time, narrowly avoiding a serious injury. Now, accidents on set weren't unusual in the rough-and-tumble days of old Hollywood. Safety protocols were nowhere near as strict as they are today. But what set this incident apart was Bogart's reaction. He didn't brush it off as bad luck. Instead, he became convinced Holden had done it deliberately, or at the very least, that he had been dangerously careless. To Bogart, this wasn't a rookie mistake. It was a personal affront. From that moment on, he carried the suspicion with him. Bogart told colleagues he didn't trust Holden and believed he lacked the discipline and respect needed to be a true professional. And once Bogart made up his mind about someone, there was little chance of redemption. He was notorious for his sharp tongue and his refusal to sugarcoat his feelings. So behind the scenes, a quiet hostility began brewing. What makes this incident so fascinating is how it highlights both men's contrasting personalities. Bogart was older, hardened by years of struggle and rejection. He approached acting with a seriousness that came from fighting for every opportunity. Holden, meanwhile, was still green, eager to please, and more inclined to take risks. Their clash wasn't just about one motorcycle. It was about two very different philosophies colliding on the same set. And though the movie itself faded into relative obscurity, that one scene left an impact far greater than anything in the final cut. For Bogart, the near miss became proof that Holden was reckless, arrogant, and unworthy of his trust. And that suspicion never went away. But if Bogart thought he'd never have to deal with Holden again, he was wrong. Fate would bring them together years later. And when it did, the old grudge returned with explosive force. By the early 1950s, Humphrey Bogart was no longer just a respected actor. He was an icon. He had Casablanca behind him, an Academy Award under his belt, and a reputation as one of Hollywood's most bankable leading men. William Holden, meanwhile, had become a star in his own right, thanks to his breakthrough in Sunset Boulevard and a string of critical and commercial hits. On paper, putting these two powerhouses together in Billy Wilder's Sabrina should have been a dream, but for Bogart, the nightmare from years earlier was still fresh. When Bogart learned Holden would be his co-star, he wasn't just disappointed. He was furious. He told friends he didn't want Holden anywhere near the set. He reportedly even lobbied against the casting, insisting he couldn't work with a man who had once nearly injured him. But Wilder held his ground. Holden was hot property, and with Audrey Hepburn also attached, the film had all the makings of a hit. Reluctantly, Bogart signed on, but he made it clear he wouldn't forgive or forget. From day one, the tension was obvious. Bogart kept his distance from Holden, rarely speaking to him outside of takes. Crew members recalled icy silences and curt exchanges that made everyone on set uncomfortable. Bogart's disdain wasn't subtle, and Holden, though usually easygoing, couldn't completely ignore it. He tried to charm his way into easing the tension, cracking jokes, flashing that boyish smile, but Bogey wasn't having it. To him, Holden wasn't just a colleague. He was a reminder of disrespect, carelessness, and betrayal. The situation grew even more complicated thanks to Audrey Hepburn. Young, elegant, and enchanting, she was the heart of Sabrina. Off-screen, she found herself caught between two very different men. Bogart was much older, reserved, and often brooding, while Holden was youthful, playful, and quick to make her laugh. Rumors swirled that Holden and Hepburn grew close during filming, which only fueled Bogart's irritation. He had little patience for set romances and believed such distractions cheapened the craft. In his mind, Holden was once again proving himself unprofessional. Adding to the friction was Bogart's disdain for the role itself. He had originally hoped for Cary Grant to play opposite him, and when Grant turned the part down, Bogart felt stuck in a romantic comedy that didn't suit his gritty screen persona. Every irritation on set missed cues, while the perfectionist directing style and Holden's presence seemed to magnify his resentment. And yet, despite all the tension, the final product was a triumph. Sabrina became a critical and commercial success, cementing Hepburn's stardom and furthering Holden's reputation. But for Bogart, the experience only solidified his grudge. In later interviews, he didn't hesitate to voice his dislike for Holden, calling him a pretty boy and dismissing his acting as shallow. Holden, for his part, rarely fired back, but those close to him admitted he was stung by Bogart's open contempt. The film may have looked glamorous on screen, but behind the scenes, the atmosphere was anything but. What audiences saw as sparkling chemistry was, in reality, laced with bitterness, resentment, and rivalry that never truly faded. But Bogart's issues with Holden weren't limited to personal grudges. There was also something deeper at play, a clash of values, lifestyles, and reputations that went beyond Hollywood lights. If there was one thing that defined William Holden outside his work, it was his love for Hollywood's glittering nightlife. Known as a man who could light up any room, Holden was a fixture at parties, gatherings, and high-profile events. He enjoyed the limelight, the drinks, and the sense of camaraderie that came with being part of the Hollywood in crowd. Friends often described him as charming, funny, and dangerously charismatic. Humphrey Bogart, on the other hand, couldn't have been more different, though he had a reputation as a heavy drinker himself. Bogart wasn't one to indulge in wild antics in front of others. He preferred his privacy, his small circle of trusted friends, and above all, professionalism. While Holden thrived in the chaotic, fast-paced lifestyle of a Hollywood star, Bogart saw that very culture as shallow and destructive. For Bogey, acting was about glamour. It was a craft, something to be respected and treated with discipline. This clash of values made it nearly impossible for the two men to get along. Bogart often dismissed Holden as immature, someone who cared more about parties and perfecting his roles. He didn't hide his skepticism, once referring to Holden as a playboy masquerading as an actor. Harsh words, especially considering Holden was already celebrated for his talent. But in Bogart's eyes, Holden's off-screen lifestyle overshadowed his work. To make matters worse, Bogart wasn't alone in his opinion. Within the old guard of Hollywood, actors who had cut their teeth in the 1930s and 1940s, Holden represented something they distrusted, a new generation of stars who seemed more focused on fame and pleasure than tradition and discipline. Bogart prided himself on being part of that older generation, men who had fought for respect in a business that often treated actors as disposable. To him, Holden wasn't just another co-star. He was a symbol of a changing Hollywood that Bogart didn't quite trust. The gossip columns of the time only fueled the animosity. Holden's affairs, drinking habits, and reckless behavior made headlines, while Bogart was celebrated as a devoted husband to Lauren Bacall and a man who valued loyalty. Every story about Holden's excesses reinforced Bogart's low opinion of him. Friends of Bogart would later recall how he would scoff whenever Holden's name came up, muttering about his lack of backbone, or rolling his eyes at his latest escapades. And yet, Holden wasn't entirely oblivious. Though he never directly confronted Bogart's disdain, he was well aware of it. Some say he even resented the fact that no matter how many awards or box office hits he racked up, Bogart's generation would never see him as their equal. It wasn't just about personality clashes. It was about respect, and Holden knew he would never earn it from Bogey. This deeper clash went beyond a single set or a single movie. It was a culture war between two very different ideas of what it meant to be a Hollywood star. For Bogart, the actor was an artist first and a public figure second. For Holden, the two were intertwined, inseparable from the very fabric of his life. But the story doesn't end with a simple disagreement about values. Because just when tension seemed to have cooled, a shocking turn of events brought their feud back into the spotlight. Just when it seemed like Humphrey Bogart and William Holden's quiet feud would fade into the background of Hollywood chatter, one scandal brought everything boiling to the surface. And this time, it wasn't just about clashing personalities. It was about betrayal headlines, and the one thing Bogart valued above all else, loyalty. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, Hollywood was a small town wrapped in glitz. Everyone knew everyone, and rumors spread faster than wildfire. At the heart of the storm came whispers about an incident that linked Holden directly to Lauren Bacall, Bogart's beloved wife. Bacall was one of the most admired women in Hollywood, smart, stunning, and fiercely independent. Her partnership with Bogart was legendary, and together they were seen as the ultimate Hollywood power couple. But as gossip spread, stories began circulating that Holden had gotten a little too friendly with Bacall during one of Hollywood's infamous late-night parties. No one ever proved whether the rumor was true or not, but in Hollywood, proof didn't matter. Perception did. For Bogart, just the idea that Holden might have crossed that line was enough to set his temper ablaze. To him, Holden wasn't just reckless anymore. He was disrespectful. Bogart reportedly confronted friends about it, venting his frustration. And while he never publicly confirmed his anger, insiders claimed that he vowed Holden would never be welcome on a set he controlled. The timing couldn't have been worse. Holden's star was on the rise, and he was beginning to be seen as one of Hollywood's leading men, even winning an Academy Award later in his career. But behind the curtain, his reputation was tainted by this scandal. Casting directors whispered, producers hesitated, and directors worried about the potential drama of pairing him with Bogart. It was clear Holden was talented, but he was also radioactive when it came to working anywhere near bogey. The press didn't help matters. Columnists loved to pit Hollywood heavyweights against each other, and stories about Bogart's disdain for Holden gave them endless material, whether true or exaggerated. The headlines painted a picture of two titans locked in a battle of egos. Bogart, the old-school tough guy who demanded respect, versus Holden, the golden boy whose charm sometimes crossed into arrogance. Friends of both actors tried to downplay the feud, but the damage was done. Hollywood insiders began to say what many suspected, that Bogart's private grudge had real consequences. If Bogart didn't want someone around, he had the influence to make it happen. And Holden, despite his box office success, was no exception. For Bogart, it wasn't just about one rumor. It was about principle. He could tolerate differences in lifestyle, but he wouldn't forgive what he saw as a personal slight. Loyalty was sacred to him, and Holden's reputation as a party-loving charmer didn't mix well with the sanctity of Bogart's marriage. The result was a hard line that would never be erased. But here's the twist. As the years passed, this feud didn't just stay a Hollywood secret. It spilled over into public perception, shaping how both men were remembered. And it revealed just how much power Bogart had in the industry when he set his mind against someone. When word spread that Humphrey Bogart had effectively blacklisted William Holden from his orbit, Hollywood sat up and paid attention. This wasn't just a casual disagreement between actors. It was a declaration. In an industry where reputation was everything, Bogart's refusal to work with or even tolerate Holden sent shockwaves through casting rooms and producer offices alike. Bogart wasn't just another movie star. He was the face of gritty, no-nonsense Hollywood. He commanded respect, and his career was proof that he wasn't afraid to speak his mind. For producers, keeping Bogart happy often meant keeping certain people far away from their sets. Holden quickly found out what it meant to be on the wrong side of that equation. Scripts that might have paired the two together were quietly shelved, and opportunities vanished before Holden ever knew they were on the table. Some insiders even whispered that Holden lost out on roles that could have elevated him earlier in his career because of Bogart's disdain. While Holden eventually found his way to superstardom in films like Stalag 17 and Sunset Boulevard, he couldn't entirely shake the shadow of Bogart's grudge. Industry insiders knew if Bogey didn't want you around, doors could slam shut faster than you realized. And it wasn't just professional. Hollywood parties and social circles were small, tight-knit webs of connections. If Bogart and Bacall were attending, Holden often wasn't invited. Or if he was, the tension was thick enough to make other guests uncomfortable. For a man who thrived on charm and charisma, being iced out socially was almost as damaging as being shut out professionally. Still, Holden wasn't the type to sit quietly and lick his wounds. He kept pushing forward, delivering performances that critics couldn't ignore. But that didn't mean the whispers died down. Gossip columnists loved the idea of a feud between the smooth, rising star and the established tough guy, and they leaned into it. Whether the stories were exaggerated or not, the narrative became part of both men's legacies. Bogart was painted as fiercely protective, maybe even vengeful. Holden was cast as the reckless charmer who crossed a line he shouldn't have. Behind the scenes, some tried mend fences. Mutual friends hoped that as Bogart aged and Holden matured, time would soften the bitterness. But insiders say Bogart's principles didn't allow much room for forgiveness. To him, Holden had shown a lack of respect, not just to him, but a Bacall, and that was a scar that never really healed. By the time Bogart's health began to decline in the mid-1950s, their feud was cemented in Hollywood lore. For Bogart, it was proof of his unwillingness to compromise on loyalty. For Holden, it was a reminder that talent and charm alone weren't enough to navigate the minefield of old Hollywood's politics. The fallout was clear. Holden's career survived and even thrived, but the path wasn't as smooth as it might have been. And Bogart's legacy as a man who demanded respect, even if it meant burning bridges, was locked in forever. But here's where the story takes another unexpected turn. Even after Bogart was gone, the shadow of their feud lingered in ways no one could have predicted. Long after Humphrey Bogart's passing in 1957, his feud with William Holden continued to echo through Hollywood like a whispered cautionary tale. The clash between the two men wasn't just about personal dislike. It came to symbolize the way grudges, egos, and rivalries shaped the golden age of Hollywood. Unlike today, where publicists can spin nearly any story, the 1940s and 50s often left reputations to rise or crumble based on word of mouth. And when a name as big as Bogart's carried a grudge, it had staying power. For Holden, the feud became both a burden and an odd kind of badge. By the 1960s, he was celebrated as one of Hollywood's greatest leading men, earning Oscars and starring in landmark films. But journalists never stopped poking at the old wound. Interviews often circled back to his relationship, or lack thereof, with Bogart, as though the world couldn't let go of the tension. Holden usually brushed off questions with vague answers, never admitting just how much the rift had cost him. Yet those who knew him privately said the subject always hit a nerve. As for Bogart, the legend of his feud only deepened his tough guy image. Fans who idolized his no-nonsense screen persona saw the Holden situation as proof that Bogey lived by the same rules off-screen. Loyalty was sacred, and betrayal wasn't forgiven. In a way, his refusal to back down made him larger than life, almost mythic. He became the embodiment of a man who valued principle over politics, even when it came at a price. But perhaps the most fascinating part of the feud's legacy was how it influenced Hollywood's unwritten rules. Younger actors were often reminded of the Bogart, Holden clash as a warning. Respect boundaries, respect your peers, and above all, don't cross someone who has more power than you. Studios may have been the official gatekeepers, but the stars themselves had enormous sway, and Bogart's handling of Holden proved just how far that influence could reach. In later decades, retrospectives on both men's careers often place their feud in the broader context of old Hollywood rivalries. Alongside tales of Bette Davis versus Joan Crawford or Frank Sinatra's icy relationship with Marlon Brando, the Bogart-Holden conflict became part of the fabric of Hollywood history. What made it stand out was the raw personal nature of it. It wasn't about competing for roles or accolades, but about respect, loyalty, and personal boundaries that had been crossed. Today, film historians still debate how much of the story has been exaggerated over time. Some suggest Bogart's supposed ban on Holden has been blown out of proportion, while others insist the grudge was every bit as intense as gossip columns claimed. Either way, the fact that it's still being discussed decades later proves the staying power of their feud. It wasn't just an argument between two men. It was a reflection of the volatile, glamorous, and sometimes ruthless world of classic Hollywood. And in a strange twist, both men's reputations benefited from the drama. Bogart was remembered as a man of unwavering principle, Holden as a flawed but fascinating actor who managed to thrive despite powerful enemies. Their feud became part of their legends, proof that even in the golden glow of Tinseltown, shadows always lingered. But as Hollywood moved on, one question remained. If Bogart had lived longer, would he and Holden ever have buried the hatchet? Looking back, the feud between Humphrey Bogart and William Holden was more than just a clash of personalities. It was a story that revealed the raw, unpolished truth about Hollywood's golden era, a world where glamour masked fragile egos and personal grudges could shape careers as powerfully as studio contracts. Bogart, with his steely resolve and no-nonsense persona, carried the fight to his grave, refusing to bend to someone he felt had crossed a line. Holden, meanwhile, went on to carve out an impressive career. Yet the shadow of Bogart's disdain followed him, a reminder that even the brightest stars couldn't escape the gravity of a feud with Hollywood royalty. What made their conflict so captivating was how personal it felt. This wasn't about who won an award or who landed the lead role in a blockbuster. It wasn't about the critics, the studios, or the money. At its core, it was about respect, something Bogart valued above all else, and something Holden, in his charm and recklessness, often played fast and loose with. The spark that ignited between them was small, but the fire it created lasted long beyond their lifetimes. The legacy of this feud says a lot about the Golden Age itself. Stars weren't just actors. They were symbols, cultural icons who defined the era. Every choice they made, every feud they carried, shaped the mythology of Hollywood. And in this mythology, Bogart stood as an immovable object, holding the irresistible force. Their collision was inevitable, and the fallout became legend. Even now, decades later, audiences remain fascinated by these stories. Perhaps it's because they strip away the illusion of perfection that old Hollywood loved to sell. We don't just remember Bogart for Casablanca or Holden for Sunset Boulevard. We remember them as men, flawed and fiery, whose personal battles made them human. And in some ways, those flaws only deepened their mystique. But here's the real takeaway. Their feud reminds us that behind the glittering lights and red carpets, Hollywood has always been built on fragile alliances and hidden rivalries. The industry thrives on image, but it's the stories of what happens off-camera that keep people talking for generations. Bogart and Holden gave us one of those timeless tales, and the fact that it still sparks debate today proves just how much it resonated. So the next time you watch a Bogart classic or a Holden masterpiece, you might notice something new, an undercurrent of tension, a trace of that legendary rivalry woven into the fabric of their legacies. Because in Hollywood, even grudges become part of the story, and that's what keeps us coming back. If you enjoyed diving into this untold chapter of Hollywood history, don't forget to hit that like button. Subscribe for more hidden stories from the Golden Age, and ring the bell so you never miss the next reveal. Because behind every star, there's a secret waiting to be uncovered.